Chapter 5. Natural Selection, a Closer Look. Criticism of natural selection began to appear while later editions of The Origin of Species were still being written. In The Genesis of Species, for example, the English biologist St. George Jackson Mivart, 1827 to 1900, expressed doubt whether selection could explain the early stages of useful structures, the eye in particular. Darwin replied, in his 6th edition, that in several cases the animal kingdom showed sensitivity to light in different stages. But the cases he cited were not related by descent. It was as though an architect were to show cave dwellings and then Chartres Cathedral with thatched cottages as intermediates, to demonstrate that cavemen could have built the cathedral. We ought to look exclusively to its lineal progenitors, Darwin allowed, but this is scarcely ever possible. In that case, how can we know that eyes evolved step by step? We can't. In fact, such a claim is a deduction from Darwin's theory. Mivart's criticism of natural selection has been repeated ever since. Harvard professor R.C. Lewontin made the same point in a 1999 interview. In his book, The Deniable Darwin, 2009, David Berlinski criticized claims by Dan Nilsson and Suzanne Pelger, based on computer calculations, that the eye could have evolved one bit at a time. Conveniently, they start by assuming an organism endowed with a light-sensitive patch. Mivart's comments also resembled A.R. Wallace's, in that neither believed the human mind could be solely a product of material causes. Mivart, who became a Roman Catholic, quarreled with the anti-Catholic T.H. Huxley, although Huxley had at first impressed him. As to natural selection, Mivart said, I accepted it completely, and in fact my doubts and difficulties were first excited by attending Professor Huxley's lectures at the School of Mines. Mivart also attacked Darwin's later book, The Descent of Man, 1871, for which Darwin seems not to have forgiven him. A number of modern academics have also doubted whether natural selection is sufficient to cause speciation and everything else. James Shapiro, a molecular biologist at the University of Chicago, believes that spontaneous genome organization must somehow be involved. Comparably, Mivart, over 100 years earlier, saw an internal force or tendency. But neo-Darwinian rules exclude reliance on such forces, whether internal or spontaneous. As a source of variation, randomness must prevail. In the 20th century, criticism of natural selection rarely appeared before the Darwin Centennial. Then, in a symposium at the Y-Star Institute in 1966, it was attacked by C.H. Waddington, who had also criticized it a few years earlier at the Chicago Centenary. The Y-Star Symposium was entitled Mathematical Challenges to the Neo-Darwinian Interpretation of Evolution. This time, Waddington said that some of the statements of neo-Darwinism are vacuous. Darwin's understanding of fitness was later turned into a lot of mathematics, Waddington said, and then redefined simply in terms of leaving offspring. It was smuggled in that the animals leaving the most offspring are going to be the fastest horses, or something of that sort. But nothing like that was explicit in the theory. All it said was that some organisms will leave more offspring than others. Then Waddington added, the whole real guts of evolution, which is how do you come to have horses and tigers and things, is outside the mathematical theory. The probability of generating new genetic information by random DNA mutations was also discussed by Y-Star participants, among them MIT engineering professor Murray Eden and R.C. Lewontin, who was then at the University of Chicago. The problem that Professor Eden addressed was logically prior to natural selection, which can only select something if random mutation has already generated it. The skeptics at Y-Star argued that assembling a new gene or protein is mathematically highly improbable because of the sheer number of base or amino acid sequences, as Discovery Institute's Stephen Meyer wrote in Signature in the Cell, 2011. For every combination that produces a functional protein, there exist literally billions of other combinations that do not. This argument will be further explored in my chapter on intelligent design. A conflict with Gould. In 1976, I published an article in Harper's Magazine about some of these issues, but without delving into the mathematical challenges. I did bring up Waddington's discussion of natural selection, saying it seemed unlikely that a criterion of fitness independent of survival could ever be identified. The article received a good deal of attention, both hostile and friendly. One who responded was Stephen Jay Gould, who had only recently inaugurated his monthly column in Natural History magazine. One of his earliest articles, Darwin's Untimely Burial, was reprinted in his book Ever Since Darwin, 1977. Surprisingly, Gould did propose an independent criterion of fitness, but first he said this: Bethell's argument has a curious ring for most practicing scientists. We are always ready to watch a theory fall under the impact of new data, but we do not expect a great and influential theory to collapse from a logical error in its formulation. He conceded that Darwin's attempt to establish an independent criterion of fitness by analogy with artificial selection had failed. The pigeon fancier knows what he wants, Gould said. The fittest pigeons are not defined by their survival. They are, rather, allowed to survive because they possess desired traits. Then he came to his key point. Certain morphological, physiological, and behavioral traits should be superior a priori as designs for living in new environments. These traits confer fitness by an engineer's criterion of good design, not by the empirical fact of their survival and spread. Well, what about an engineer's criterion of good design? Animals certainly look well designed, but Darwinians are obliged to regard that as an illusion. Richard Dawkins famously said that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. The illusion arose, Dawkins thought, because those complicated things went through millennia of improvement by natural selection. But to return to Gould, in his next book, The Panda's Thumb, 1980, he corrected himself. He said that the panda's thumb is a contraption, not a lovely contrivance. It is a somewhat clumsy but quite workable solution. Pandas are all thumbs when they strip bamboo stalks, but they do it effectively enough. Gould then added that an engineer's best solution is debarred by history, meaning that the thumb had to be added on to other irreplaceable panda structures. So the panda's thumb wins no prize in an engineer's derby. Gould made a similar criticism of orchid design. Darwin wrote a short book about orchids in 1862. So Gould's engineer's solution didn't work in particular cases. In fact, Gould is among those biologists who regard bad design as good evidence for evolution. After all, he said, if we can bring a designer into the picture, we are surely entitled to assume that he's a good designer. In 1983, Gould wrote that evolution lies exposed in the imperfections that record a history of descent. Discussing the limbs of rats, bats, and porpoises, for example, he said that an engineer, starting from scratch, could design better limbs in each case. But bad design in nature can hardly be regarded as evidence that a designer doesn't exist. Brown University biologist Kenneth Miller, whose book Only a Theory, 2008, was a lengthy attack on the intelligent design movement, saw that the bad design argument was a poor one. Consider the Edsel or the Yugo or any other poorly designed piece of automotive machinery. However bad the results, there is no doubt that these cars were in fact designed. Maybe not very well, but designed nonetheless. Imperfection, therefore, does not argue for evolution. A few years later, Gould threw caution to the winds and used a misleading analogy to show how natural selection might work. In An Urchin in the Storm, 1987, he responded to criticism by the astronomer Robert Jastrow. Jastrow had questioned whether man could possibly have arisen as the product of a succession of chance events occurring during the last 4 billion years. It was a teaching moment for Gould. Jastrow's claim rests on a basic misunderstanding of Darwin, Gould wrote. If, in the hoary metaphor, monkeys type at random, we will never get the Aeneid if we must start each trial from scratch. But if we may keep the letters that, by chance, turn up in the right places and start each new trial with these correct letters in place, we will eventually get arma virumque cano, and all the rest. Richard Dawkins used the same argument, applying it to the line in Hamlet, "Methinks it is like a weasel." Monkeys will arrive at that too, if they are allowed to keep the letters positioned correctly by accident, Dawkins wrote. But that argument assumed what Gould, Dawkins, and all other Darwinians disallow, that evolution has a goal. Inconsistently, Dawkins was positing that an intelligent agent was conveniently on hand, looking over the monkeys' shoulders, scrutinizing the gibberish they typed, and preserving the correctly placed letters. Where did that intelligent agent come from? Darwin's theory had supposedly removed the need for any such intelligence, but further study of the problem has shown intelligence to be essential. Encounter with Lewontin. I wrote to Gould and asked if I could go and see him. He replied that he would be happy to talk, but that a better choice would be his colleague, Richard C. Lewontin, a geneticist and, by then, the Alexander Agassiz Professor of Zoology at Harvard. Appointed in 1973, he was earlier a student of Dobzhansky's at the University of Chicago. Gould told me that Lewontin was interested in these same questions, so I went to see him. He welcomed me into his office. It is impossible to talk to Lewontin for 5 minutes without being impressed by his intelligence. He is a man of the left, and like Gould, was also known to proclaim his Marxism. Gould said he learned it at his daddy's knee. The field called sociobiology had been brewing at that moment. In fact, brewing in Edward O. Wilson's office right above Lewontin's in the same Harvard building. Wilson's Sociobiology, The New Synthesis, was published in 1975. Most of Wilson's book dealt with social insects, but the final chapter dealt with human behavior, which he said was partly shaped by genes. This was judged to be determinism, and demonstrations against it were promptly mounted by a group called Science for the People. But that gets us into the sociobiology story, which I explore in Chapter 16. Lewontin, indeed, was critical of natural selection, which, like Bertrand Russell, he saw as an invasion of biology by economics. Karl Marx felt the same way. Some thought that in raising Marxian objections to Darwinism, Lewontin was importing his own philosophy into biology. But he had a point, surely. It was the laissez-faire economist Thomas Robert Malthus, whose ideas had suggested natural selection to Darwin in the first place. On reading Malthus, Darwin wrote in his autobiography, "Here then I had at last got a theory by which to work." And decades before Lewontin, Julian Huxley had referred to the planetary system of laissez-faire that we call natural selection. Lewontin elaborated on his criticism of natural selection in his book Biology as Ideology, 1991. Darwin's whole theory of evolution by natural selection bears an uncanny resemblance to the political economy of early capitalism as developed by the Scottish economists. Darwin had some knowledge of the economic survival of the fittest because he earned his living from investment in shares he followed daily in the newspapers. What Darwin did was take early 19th century political economy and expand it to include all of natural economy. Lewontin also made a key substantive criticism of natural selection. He repeated it several times, but the best version came in an article he wrote for Nature, testing the theory of natural selection. According to Karl Popper's Logic of Scientific Discovery, Lewontin wrote, "The first rule for any scientific hypothesis is that it ought to be possible to think of an observation that would contradict it. For what good is a theory that is guaranteed by its internal logical structure to agree with all conceivable observations irrespective of the real structure of the world? If scientists are going to use logically unbeatable theories about the world, they might as well give up natural science and take up religion. Yet is that not exactly the situation with regard to Darwinism? Lewontin gave the example of a species of bird with a small beak that evolved a larger one, and did so because some aspect of the environment had changed, causing larger beaked birds to leave more offspring. Such a theory can never be falsified, for it merely asserts that some environmental difference created the conditions for natural selection of a new character, Lewontin wrote. The claim is existentially quantified so that the failure to find the environmental factor proves nothing, except that one has not looked hard enough. Existential quantification can be put more simply. If a new character appears, it is not explained by saying that something in the environment changed. We need to know what changed. Such a claim can then be tested, and perhaps shown to be false. Oddly enough, 2 decades after Lewontin wrote that, a real case of increased beak size was reported, in finches on the Galapagos Islands, no less. Darwin had spent a few weeks there on board HMS Beagle in 1835. Peter and Rosemary Grant's research on the Galapagos finches was publicly reported in the 1980s. Further, the size in beak change they reported was associated with a particular environmental change, drought. The problem was that after the drought ended, the average beak size of the birds reverted to normal. There was no net evolution, much less speciation, wrote Discovery Institute's Jonathan Wells. All the finch changes oscillated about a mean and did not produce what Darwin had called an incipient species. The Galapagos Islands are sometimes said to have been the source of Darwin's ideas about evolution. The variety of finches on the different Galapagos Islands may have played a role, but the laissez-faire economic outlook prevalent in England at the time is a much better candidate. Darwin gave a rare and imaginary illustration of natural selection in The Origin of Species, illustrating Lewontin's point. Darwin supposed an environment in which wolves were hard-pressed for food and prey was scarce. He could see no reason to doubt that the swiftest and slimmest wolves would have the best chance of surviving and to be preserved or selected. Let's accept Darwin's scenario. Imagine that by an accidental mutation, a wolf is indeed swifter and outruns all the others. Then the wolf must really catch a deer, eat it, find a mate, leave more offspring, transmitting the new swift gene to them, and so on. The problem is that once a different environment is postulated, and a change in the animal's constitution counts as such, there is no limit to the number of possibilities that can account for a different outcome, an outcome in which the swift wolf in practice fails to survive. Darwin recognized the problem because he added this proviso, provided always that speedy wolves retained strength to master their prey at this or at some other period of the year. But we can't just assume that only the wolf's speed is affected. Let's assume that a researcher in the field decides that a swift wolf will be selected for. After investigating the outcome, he finds that his theory is false. How does he react? Does he phone nature and say, "Hold the space, I've just falsified Darwin's natural selection"? Of course not. He concludes that some other factor was acting in that environment. I don't know what it is right now, he might say, but I'll keep looking. As Lewontin said, the failure to find the environmental factor proves nothing, except that one has not looked hard enough. In short, we can't simply say swiftness confers fitness, because maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. It depends on reactions within that ever-changing thing called the environment. The problem is that the environment in which variations appear has literally thousands of components, and they can never be exhaustively specified or controlled for. In assuming that nothing else does change, Darwinians do their own controlled, that is, thought experiments, and see them through to a conclusion that is satisfying to them. The next day, Lewontin invited me to join him with some students on the lawn outside the Museum of Comparative Zoology. Here he made the basic point that a new adaptation won't be selected for unless it displays some relative advantage at the outset, which was Mivart's initial point about the eye. Later, Lewontin repeated the argument, and on the record in an interview with Lingua Franca. The journalist who wrote the article quoted Lewontin as saying, "We'd be better off flying. It would increase our fitness. We'd be better able to flee from predators. But if we flap our arms, we don't get any lift." He stands up and starts flapping his arms to illustrate. "Even if I picked up a pair of ping-pong paddles, it wouldn't help." He's walking around the room now, madly flapping his arms and still not getting any lift. "Until you're doing something, you're not doing it," Lewontin says by way of summary. And natural selection can't help. What natural selection does is to make more efficient what the organism is already doing. His argument was that natural selection alone can't explain the origin of flight or of any complicated new function. Unless a small change gives an animal an advantage, the change won't be selected for, and obviously a little bit of a wing doesn't do any good. Lewontin's commitment to materialism is another aspect of his worldview that should be stressed. Consider the following comments in the New York Review of Books. They made a big impression at the time because they were so forthrightly expressed. "We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. The eminent Kant scholar Louis Beck used to say that anyone who could believe in God could believe in anything. To appeal to an omnipotent deity is to allow that at any moment the regularities of nature may be ruptured, that miracles may happen. His point was that materialists don't believe in their philosophy because they are convinced by evolutionist claims. It is the other way around. They believe that the history of life can be explained by evolutionary processes because of their prior commitment to materialism. His argument can be restated this way. Complex, self-replicating organisms certainly exist, but in a purely material world, they can only arise by the slow accumulation of fortuitous changes, one after the other. So Darwinism, or something very similar to it, is close to being a deduction from a materialist premise. One who saw what was going on was Karl Marx. Writing to Engels in 1862, he said that for Darwin, the animal kingdom figures as civil society. It is remarkable how Darwin recognizes among the beasts and plants his English society with its division of labor, competition, opening up of new markets, invention, and the Malthusian struggle for existence. Marx admired Darwin, not of course for his economics, but for his materialism. Recommending The Origin to Ferdinand Lassalle, he wrote that despite all deficiencies, Darwin had for the first time dealt a death blow to teleology in the natural sciences. Darwinism forbids any reference to purpose or teleology, as it does to causes beyond the physical world. In fact, it seemed to make such causes redundant. In that sense, Darwin and Marx were comrades indeed. In the museum's elevator, no sign of E.O. Wilson coming down, and therefore no hushed silences, Lewontin asked me, out of the blue, why I thought sexual reproduction had appeared among living things. It had not occurred to me that that presented a problem for Darwinism. But years later, the biochemist Michael Behe told me that it does. In the Darwinian view, Behe said, the whole point of reproduction is to get your genes into the next generation. But with sexual reproduction, you only transmit half, the other half being contributed by your partner. So why does that happen? Nobody knows. Lewontin implied that he didn't know either. Lewontin's worldview encouraged him to take a critical look at natural selection, which Darwinians have almost always been reluctant to do. Today, in fact, some of those who might well agree with Lewontin about natural selection are likely to remain silent lest their unorthodoxy should attract reprisals within the Academy. Lewontin had no such fears, and he made an impression on me and many others for that reason. But we need to look at a related issue. What is the modern scientific evidence that natural selection has really been observed? That is the subject of the next chapter.